Hi, I'm Matt Hodgkinson. I'm an associate editor at PLOS One. So I'm here to talk about being a mentor with AuthorAID. So I don't, as such, officially have my PLOS hat on today. I got a volunteering day to come here, so I didn't have to take holiday. But I will talk a little bit about PLOS at the end. So about me, I did a degree in biological sciences and then a research master's in genetics. I decided I didn't like being a researcher so much, so I went off to the world of publishing instead. So I worked at Biomed Central for a while, for about 6 years as an editor there. So I learnt the trade of peer review and critical appraisal, and I've worked with PLOS One at the Public Library of Science in Cambridge since 2010. I've got a blog where you can read some of my thoughts. It's a bit stale now, but I'm sure some of it still applies, and I tweet a lot as well. So open access. So that's what I've been doing for like the last decade, is working for open access journal publishers. So free to read and reuse immediately and requiring only attribution is a précis of the kind of official definition of open access. So accept no substitutes. So Biomed Central and PLOS are both open access journal publishers, but you can get open access in a different way, which is you can get access or free access to articles which have been either, you can get preprints such as arXiv, which is very popular in physics, or you can get postprints or self-archiving, where people take copies of the article without all of the publisher formatting and put it on institutional repositories and places like PubMed Central. So that's another way that you can get access. So INASP, I actually looked it up because I'd completely forgotten what the acronym stood for, and it's the International Network for the Availability of Scientific Publications, and that concept is very similar to what PLOS is interested in, which is accelerating science communication. So open access is all about getting access for readers, but what about access for authors? And this is something that we recognize can be a problem for especially developing country authors. I'll go a little bit later into the kind of funding issues, but one of the big issues can be that people have real trouble publishing in international journals. They run up against language problems, but they also run up against problems with peer review and peer reviewers that they're not used to in their local settings, and suddenly their papers get ripped to shreds. So there's a much higher rejection rate from developing country authors, and this is something that I've experienced all of the journals I've seen. I think it's fairly much a universal. I think especially now journals are seeing a big problem with papers coming in from China, where there's a huge burgeoning amount of research. I mean, whether China can even be classed as a developing country or not, is disputed. But the rejection rate is, if the acceptance rate in the US for PLOS One is about 80%, the acceptance rate in China is more like 40%. And you're going to get similar rates in other developing countries, maybe 40 or 50%. It's a lot lower. Part of the reason that I joined AuthorAID was a feeling of horrible guilt that we reject all of these papers and that we don't necessarily offer researchers as much help as we could. As editors, as professional editors, we're very pressed for time. We're dealing with a lot of papers and we want to assess them quickly. And there's only so much we can do to take a paper and turn it into a publishable product. And sometimes we simply have to say to the authors, this isn't ready yet, and give reasons why, and reject. And we found also that in our own staff screening, we might say, oh, well, this could be okay to go to review, but then academic editors won't take it on. Peer reviewers will refuse to peer review it because they have a low threshold as volunteers for language issues and other issues with reporting. And if there's something wrong, if a figure's missing, if there's too many typos, they will just say no. And that's something that I wanted to try to help people fix, the kind of teach a man to fish and, the warm, fuzzy feeling that Julie was talking about. So the sides of AuthorAID that I've seen are the mentoring and the discussion list. I haven't been involved in the workshops and things, although I think potentially that's something, PLOS could get involved with. I haven't really been the massive advocate for AuthorAID within PLOS, and I probably need to up my game on that. So mentoring. So I've mentored researchers from various countries. I didn't trawl through every single one of the interactions I've had. a common thing is that somebody will say, please, can you proofread my paper for English language? And I will never just proofread for English language. I will always give more than that. So there's always going to be something else. Articles that are not properly referencing the other research is another big common issue. And it's especially if you're doing work in a local setting, then I find in a lot of cases, I go and search for, previous master's theses or PhD theses or, work published in local journals, and the researchers won't necessarily have discussed those. And this can be a big issue of why papers are rejected, because they're not putting themselves in the context of the literature and explaining why it is that this work needs to be done in this setting. Sometimes there's the feeling it just has to be done so somebody can get a PhD, but not so that you're adding to knowledge. Now, PLOS One, we try and make sure that novelty is not a reason to reject, but it's still my advice to researchers is really go back and check what's been done before and put your work into the context of the literature. Pretending your work's newer than it isn't is a way to set yourself up to fail when somebody in the know says, this isn't new, this isn't the first time it's been done, and they use that as an excuse to reject your work. There's another big issue which I think particularly in China, there's a kind of cultural issue that taking someone else's work is seen as a compliment to them. In other settings, it will simply just be language issues. So people will take chunks of text that read well and they will reuse it. This can be okay in method sections sometimes. If you put, method according to blah, that's fine. But when you're starting to introduce your work or discuss your work using somebody else's wording, that becomes a big problem. More and more journals are now catching this using plagiarism checking software like Crosscheck and Turnitin. They both use the same engine, and others. You can just take chunks of text and stick it into Google Scholar. And that's some of what I find is that you need to point out when some work has, it's unattributed reuse of the words of others. That's what the real use is. And, whether you call it plagiarism or whether you call it text reuse, it is a bigger problem in developing country research than it is from elsewhere. And it has to be pointed out and corrected. And, there's cases where people rip off entire papers and stick their name on it. And, that's terrible. This isn't most of what we see up PLOS One. In my mentoring, it's mostly, small sections, but it's something that still needs education to realise. A lot of the work's very descriptive. It's kind of, we did this survey and then there's some results. And it's like, things can be analysed in more depth. And sometimes I feel that researchers can be more ambitious with the way that they analyse the work. You can do a multivariate analysis on your results and see how things interact. But that may take going and speaking to a statistician, maybe speaking to an international collaborator. So sometimes researchers are sometimes holding themselves back with what their data can provide because they don't have the confidence or the expertise to do it, and they don't have the international networks to do it. So I've sometimes suggested other international researchers that the person could approach. I think there's a difficulty with, it's much easier for international researchers who all mingle with each other at conferences to set up those collaborations, and I think that can be lacking sometimes. And there's a huge difficulty accessing previous work, which plays into the thing I was saying earlier, talk about other people's work. If you can't access it, then it's pretty difficult. But I see the same problems because I don't work at an institution with access to the subscription literature. So when I'm advising people, I'm trying to come up with the workarounds to access the stuff that I want to point them to. So I can see those difficulties as the same. My internet connection isn't as bad as it is in, Ghana, but it was when I was with Virgin Media, but okay. And then finally, I say dashboard there, that conceals a point which it's a really brilliant innovation, this new dashboard system, because previously I would get emails and I put a star on them, and then a few months later I'd realised that I'd forgotten about it, and the dashboard really helps. And I think that's one thing is with volunteer work, having that kind of thing to actually organise your work is so brilliantly helpful. I realise how hard it is for our academic editors to handle their workload as well, and this kind of dashboard is really brilliant to make sure, and I'm sure my responsiveness, if the statistics are available, has probably increased markedly since the dashboard was introduced. I certainly got back to several people from a few months before with apologies. There's a very active discussion list. It's a really good list. Lots of different people giving contributions, lots of very thoughtful things. That is a quote about a response I gave. It was about somebody asking for, wondering why he wasn't getting good responses when he was approaching people about PhD projects, and I gave various reasons why there might be problems. So that's my, I'm very modest as well. There's lots of discussion about open access and accessing traditional journals, lots of kind of requests of, can I get hold of this article? How do I access this article? There's a lot of discussion of scams. So there are scam journals out there. There are journals which, there's a scam of a journal called Wolfinia, which was or is an Austrian botany journal, but it got reinvented by some Armenian criminals as an online multidisciplinary journal because the journal didn't have a website and they stole it. And lots and lots of developing country authors have been scammed into it, and it was on the AuthorAID list that I first discovered about it, and then I've blogged about it, and I've actually reported it to the FBI. And they didn't reply. You know, that shows that, you know, and my blog post was one of the first ones to come out, and it was, you know, it's a good network for getting this warning spread about the dangers that are faced. And I think developing country authors are particularly targeted by these journals. A lot of North American and Western European authors wouldn't look twice at these journals, but they set up conferences which are essentially scams. You just turn up and you speak to an empty room. There's Thesis Publishers are a huge one. There's one called VDM and Lambert Academic, and they essentially just stick a nice picture on the front of your thesis and publish it and wait for someone to download it, and you never get royalties. And often on the AuthorAID list, people will say, oh, you could use Lambert Academic, and I have to stick my oar in and say, oh, no, actually, they're not really very credible. So there's a lot of scammers out there. Journal selection in Impact Factor is a huge one. I've pointed people to blog posts and things. Anna Sharman, who used to work with me at BMC, has very good stuff on that. People are also obsessed with the impact factor, which at PLOS we don't like. We don't think it's a very useful measure. We don't talk about our own impact factors, and we don't believe it's a useful metric. But people are still very obsessed with this number because it decides so many things. And there's something called the Declaration on Research Assessment that was signed called DORA, which I'd encourage people to go and read and sign, which says we should move away from this. But I think it's that everybody else thinks everybody else is using it, and so everyone continues using it, even though institutions and funders and researchers all say it's terrible, people keep using it. People want to know how peer review works as well. People want to know about different ways of peer review, double-blind review, bias in review. There was a recent discussion about gender bias and country bias in review as well. And a big issue is authorship as well. There's lots of issues with gift authorship, where people get themselves onto papers they don't deserve to be on. There's ghost authorship, where people get suppressed from being on journals, and this happens across the world. But I think particularly in India it may be an issue, and then some other countries there's cultural issues where people elbow their way onto papers and other people get lack of credit. And there's confusion about what you have to do to be an author. So quickly to go on to PLOS in developing countries, we've got an international advisory group. So this is made up of academics and others from around the world and in developing countries. And one thing that we found was that PLOS has always given fee waivers when people can't afford to publish in the PLOS journals. So we have publication fees, and so articles that are accepted have that fee, and the author, more usually their institution and funder, will pay for it. And we were like, oh, right, people will just apply for the waiver if they need it. But we got the advice from the International Advisory Group was you've got to give a proper, formal waiver, otherwise people won't know about it, they won't apply for it, and they will feel bad about applying for it. They'll feel like it's something that, they're getting something for nothing, even though we want them to do it. And so we formalized it so that there's groups of countries which pay no fee or pay a reduced fee, and other open access publishers, including Biomed Central, have schemes like this. I think Ubiquity Press, Brian mentioned that they do a similar waiver scheme. And then if anyone else, South Africa, for instance, isn't included in this because it has quite a large research infrastructure. But if a South African researcher felt that they couldn't pay, then they can apply for the fee assistance anyway. Editors such as myself don't get to see who's paid what. We're blinded to that, so we've got no access to that information. Another useful journal particularly for developing countries is PLOS, Neglected Tropical Diseases. It was launched in 2007, I think, as a direct outcome of some meetings that I think the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation were involved in, and Peter Hotez is the editor-in-chief, and that's a very direct aim to get the research out there. So they do a lot of work with developing country authors, I think particularly researchers in South America, and they do a lot more work than the rest of the PLOS journals on working with developing country authors. We've tried to do more recruitment of editorial board members from developing countries. We know it's, you get the usual suspects from Harvard and Yale and Oxford and Cambridge, and we need to break that kind of thing. And we've also got a discount for PLOS authors with a language editing service in the US. So if we say it needs language editing, then there's a discount there. But we know that we may need to do more there as well. I mean, this is why I wanted to volunteer with AuthorAID, because if there's language problems, we tell them to fix it. We often don't fix it ourselves. And we know that's pushing the problem back out onto those authors. So thank you to everybody in AST for inviting me, and that's how you can get in touch.